is the June version of the Educator Network series of webinars. This is now the 5th one. We've been going since February. I just can't quite believe it's June, although looking outside, I can believe it's June even here in Aberdeen. So a very warm welcome, as I say. My name's Steve Tucker. I'm the current serving Vice President Academic Development at the British Pharmacological Society, and I'm going to host a session this afternoon. Just before we kind of get into today's proceedings, just check that everyone's okay with us recording the session, certainly the first half of the session, which will be the talk on the Pharmacokinetics for All project. Bear in mind that it's only the speakers and the slides that will be captured rather than any of the individual attendees. But if there are any problems with that, if you just contact education at BPS, that would be great. Okay, thanks. I'd like to take this opportunity just to explain the kind of way that the proceedings will work this afternoon. We're going to start off with a talk by Jenny and Shola from Nottingham, who are going to tell us a bit about their Pharmacokinetics for All project. And then in the second half, as always, we're going to break out into smaller groups and discuss the ongoing core curriculum review that we've been involved in over these 5 sessions. So it all fits quite tightly into the hour, so we should crack on. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome Jenny Koenig and Shola Olafuyi to the network series. They're going to give us a talk about their Pharmacokinetics for All project, which aims to, I guess, decolonize aspects of the way we teach pharmacokinetics, and it was a project that was funded by the Education and Training Committee at the BPS. So I'll hand over to Jenny and Shola, and please, if you have any questions, you can either type them in the chat and they'll be addressed at the end of the presentation, or indeed just save them and then you can ask them directly at the end of the presentation. So I'd like to invite Jenny and Shola to give us their presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay, is that all right? You're seeing that okay? Good, lovely, thank you. So, yes, so thank you for the opportunity to speak about this project. We've been working on it since the beginning of the year, really. So just thinking about a year ago, I recently started at Nottingham, having to prepare a whole range of new lectures around about the time of all the Black Lives Matter and the pandemic, making people sort of rethink things again. And I picked up here and there ethnic differences in pharmacology, but didn't really feel like I knew what I should be teaching. And so when the possibility of a teaching grant came up from BPS, I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to actually really get into this. And so Shola and I got together. We both teach Pharmacokinetics at Nottingham, so it seemed like a good thing to do, to look into it a little bit more. So what we did was a project in 3 phases, really. It started off with a scoping review. So the aim of that was to highlight how differences in the diet, physiology and biochemistry across ethnic groups can affect pharmacokinetics. And the grant was used up to pay a freelance researcher, Nikita Perek, who did all of this work between January and April, I guess. And that really broke the back of it. That got us started and got us going, which was really, really helpful. The next phase, which is what we've been working on just recently, is developing some guidance, some sort of framework to help people teaching in this area and help them address this issue around diversity. Then use the findings to produce research-based learning materials, learning and teaching materials, which is what we're just launching into now. And then we're going to implement those come September, October, and through the academic year, and then evaluate their use with students. And yes, so just to say thank you very much for the education grant from the BPS that really got this going. So what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of background now and then hand over to Shola, who's going to talk through some of the findings from the scoping review. And then I'll finish off with just some ideas around our thinking about this sort of framework for developing these teaching resources. So we know that humans respond to and handle drugs differently, and we know things like age, pregnancy, disease That's relatively straightforward. You just ask somebody their birth date, and you know how old they are, and that's quite well documented. Issues around ethnicity and race are, I think, more difficult to work out because they're, I guess, harder to define. So let's just have a look at how we define ethnicity and race. So looking at race, first of all, so we think of this as a taxonomic categorization, I guess, based on sort of common traits like skin color and so on. I think one of the difficulties around it is that historically these racial categories are infused with these notions of superiority or inferiority. And people have argued that they have no place in biology. And I think that's because this idea of race, it's a social construct. There's no biological or genetic real basis to this idea of race. And I've just put some references throughout the slides if you want to follow up any of this. So we decided to really use the term ethnicity. So around about the early 2000s, a lot of the journals were having discussions about these terms and the use of these terms in the journals. And Nature Genetics in 2004 decided to use the term ancestry for information about descent, and ethnicity for cultural and social factors. And then race really only in the context of the legacy of discrimination, how race has been used in the past or is still used to discriminate. What's interesting, if you look in the UN, is that they say that there's no internationally accepted criteria possible for defining ethnicity. So if you do a census, say in Australia, you'll be given a different set of tick boxes than if you do it in the UK or in the US. And in fact, some countries, particularly some European countries, don't collect ethnicity information in their census. They might collect place of birth, parents' place of birth, immigration status, and they might use that as a proxy for ethnicity, but not actually ask people. I think the only consensus view really is that if you are going to be working on ethnicity, that you let the individual participant determine their own ethnicity. You don't assume it just by looking at them, which I think is quite important. Okay, so I'll just hand over to Shola, and she's going to talk about some of these findings. So just, Shola, just tell me when to click.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny, for the nice background to the work that we've been up to. So from the study, as Jenny said, we actually, decided to do like a scoping review of what literature currently says about the subject of interethnic differences in PK. And we thought to compare what literature suggests to what is actually reflected in current teaching in higher education. So the question of whether there is real interethnic differences in PK is, that question is real, is a valid question, because as far as we saw in our scoping review, literature evidence suggests that there is, in fact, interethnic differences in the way different people, based on their ethnicity, handles drugs. So there is, from around 237 papers that we found in our search, 74 of those papers actually identified some sort of ethnic differences in the way we handle drugs in pharmacokinetics. Next slide, please. So what we found, or what we did with the, if you like, list of papers that we found, and from the survey we took from our colleagues in higher education, was to try to determine which aspects of pharmacokinetics that we felt that those interethnic differences were more pronounced in. And if we actually look at what we found from our study, we found that the percentages of interethnic differences either reported in literature or being taught by colleagues in higher education follow the same pattern across the different PK processes, that is across absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So in a way, what our colleagues teach in higher education appears to reflect what is there in literature. And we see that there is a particular emphasis on metabolism. And this is particularly because the issue of the single nucleotide polymorphisms of certain drug metabolizing enzymes have been implicated in the, in that subject of interethnic differences in pharmacokinetics. And we see that when that subject of SNPs is talked about in literature, it actually relates to any of the ADME processes that has got something to do with drug metabolizing enzymes, and also has got something to do with transporters. So there's the argument that, or there's the thought to reflect highlights from these papers, from these publications, that when there is an interethnic differences between ethnic groups, then it is likely to be some sort, it is likely to be linked to, the SNPs. Next slide, please. And I think there is perhaps the question then is, are there potential issues with how we actually interpret these interethnic differences that have been identified in literature? Because we see that those differences in literature, or those, if you like, highlights in literature, is actually reflected in our teaching. So as most literature resources suggest that the SNPs are an important factor for interethnic differences, we also tend to teach that in higher education as well. But the question then is the occurrence of single nucleotide polymorphisms, are they actually an interethnic problem or an inter-individual issue? So if we look, we didn't actually critically analyze these papers because, that was outside the scope of our study, but just we could not help but to to notice that most of the papers, or many of the papers that talked about the likelihood of SNPs being responsible for interethnic differences, they were more related to, identifying certain functionally different alleles in either drug metabolizing enzymes or transporters in a fraction of a population. Which the question then is, if for example, I'm having there is a SNPs for a particular drug metabolizing enzyme, for if that SNP frequency is observed in 10% of the population or 20% of the population, is that sufficient justification to change the entire dosing recommendation for one population, one ethnic group, because of the sort of inter-individual variabilities you find within an ethnic group? And what we find is that there's perhaps even more differences. There is more differences in the way, variabilities in the way we handle drugs between ethnic groups than, within ethnic groups, so within a particular ethnic group is likely to find more inter-individual differences than between two ethnic groups. So I don't think when we talk about SNPs and the effects of genetics or biology generally between population groups, I think sometimes we tend to think it's a genetic issue rather than looking away from all the non-genetic issues. So another thing we thought about the interpretation of, findings from some of the studies might be also down to the sampling of subjects. So how were the subjects sampled? Were they skewed towards just one ethnic group compared to the other? So these are some of the things that we thought will be interesting to actually investigate further if we had the chance to, because that was, I mean, going into the real issues of some of the studies was actually outside of the scope of our work, but we had to identify some of these things as potential issues with the interpretation of some of the interethnic differences in PK that we identified in literature. Another point, though, to mention is the issue of location of the study, and this sometimes we feel that sometimes the location where a study is done might influence, a researcher's perception of what the outcomes of, these differences or the reasons for this differences they might want to suggest is. And we're going to highlight that in the next slide. So what we found is that from one particular study, this particular study caught my attention because it showed that there is actually significant regional differences in PK, more than there is interethnic differences in PK. So they found that in patients who live in Asian countries, for example, the bioavailability of alisertib, which is an anti-cancer drug, was found to be 52% higher amongst those compared to patients who lived in Western countries. And in fact, when the oral clearance of this particular drug, alisertib, was analyzed, found that the clearance of the drug was similar in patients who lived in Asian patients who lived in the West and non-Asian patients who lived in the West. So it was not to do with their ancestry, if you like, whether they were Asians or not, but more to do with where they lived. So the question then is, what are the factors? What could be driving these differences between, if you like, regional differences in how people respond or, handle drugs? And one thought is about diets, and we found that in our study as well. And there might be other factors which we probably have not really studied that much to be able to identify. So let's go on to the next slide then. So talking about diet, we found that obviously we know that there are certain ethnic groups that perhaps are more likely to have vegetarian diets than others. Obviously, the issue of vegetarian diets now cuts across several ethnic groups, so it wouldn't be fair for us then to, categorize people based on, vegetarian diet based on a particular ethnic group. But just to bring out the point about diet and how that could even in fact affect the absorption profile of paracetamol, for example. We found that, in vegetarians, the absorption of paracetamol is impaired, and that could be down to the impairment of the slowing down rather of the gastric emptying time, which then affects the rate of absorption of paracetamol. The next slide. Another interesting point about diet was with this study that I think we looked at as well, or we noticed as one of our, as a list of one of the studies that we found that in South Asian subjects who were predominantly on Bangladeshi diet during the time of the study, there was a twofold higher AUC of nifedipine when taken orally, and then compared to Caucasian subjects who lived in Britain and were not on the same sort of diet. So the question is whether or not, the question for me, I was just asking that what was the Bangladeshi diet? What was the country? What part of the diet could actually, in fact, influence the level of exposure of nifedipine in subjects? And there's some school of thoughts that it might be down to induction of cytochrome P450 enzyme 3A4 in particular. But obviously we see that the trend in either induction or in inhibition or upregulation or downregulation of these enzymes is not consistent. It depends on, it seems to be it seems to be, you know, different across different studies, if I can put it that way. So it might be down to the constituents of those the diet actually. So it might be something particularly related to the diet. So sometimes it's difficult to standardize what we call Bangladeshi diet and what we call Western diet. We might not really be able to tell what part of that, you know, Bangladeshi diet is causing whatever effects that we're seeing. So I think this is pointing to the fact that we don't necessarily have to always judge interethnic differences in PK to be as a result of, you know, polymorphisms. It could be other things like diet and, you know, other environmental factors that we really might not be able to point our fingers on. Next slide, please. So next to the point of weight. So another thing we found during our study that authors highlighted might be different between ethnicities and also might result in differences in pharmacokinetics is the subject of weight. So this study is by Du et al. And Dimond et al. Found that for efavirenz and selumetinib, the weights between ethnic groups significantly impacted on the exposure or the PK profile of the drug. And I mean, it's this point drives you know, this findings, you know, highlights the point that actually when we talk about an average weight for an adult, we tend to assume it's between 70 and 80 kg. And that is based on the assumption that we assume everybody across the world, regardless of what ethnic group you come from, you are likely to weigh the same as an European or North American individual. But what we find is that, in fact, average weights may vary based on your ethnic group or how you are, you know, what particular part of the world you come from. So, for example, we can see that in Africa, in Africans, so weight could be as low as less than 60 kg and not you know, between 60 and 63, I mean between 58 kg and 63 kg, and that goes down when we go on to the Southeast from people, when we go down to people from Southeast Asia and Western Pacific region who seem to have significantly lower weight compared to, you know, an LV adult who is from Europe or North America. So I think we need to begin to think about other things apart from, if you like, genetic contributions that could actually affect, you know, how we handle drugs from, you know, between ethnic groups. So those are the two main things we found. Next slide. So whether or not there are other causes or there are other reasons for interethnic differences, to be honest, from the much we found, we could not really place our fingers on all the things that could be possible. And that might be because people have not really, you know, done much work to identify it, or it could be that maybe they really are not, you know, other things really. But what we know definitely from what we found so far is diet is an issue, is something that we should want to consider when we teach our, you know, our students about how PK could be altered across ethnicity. We have to look at the social cultural practices between ethnic groups that could actually in fact impact upon how they handle drugs. And we look at other things because there is the link between weight, between diet and weight. So it's likely that those who feed on, you know, high fat content food might present as, you know, bigger or more weightier compared to those who, you know, feed on less, you know, fat content food. So these are some things that we thought to highlight and might be interesting for us to consider when we, you know, create our PK materials to teach in the future. So over to you, Jenny.
Thank you. Great. So let's just talk briefly, realize we're getting out of time, is towards some of these guidelines, because I wanted to think carefully about how we're going to approach this. What's our philosophy, if you like? So as Shola said, you know, we came to the conclusion we should use a range of reasons for interethnic differences, so diet and weight, not just genetics, and also have a look at this poor evidence for these polymorphisms and their links to ethnic differences, and maybe pick out a few of these studies and potentially create critiques or opportunities for students to critique them. I think the other thing that's interesting is to illustrate with graphs that highlight this variation and get across these ideas of how much variation. And one thing I've been using this year myself is this is a graph from Roland and Tozer, and they have a few. This is an example of liver disease in red and normal patients in black, and a few different enzymes. And you can see, I think presenting it this way makes you really realize just the extent to which there's variation and the extent to which the groups overlap. And I have to say, I was guilty of just saying, oh, the half-life of this is 5 hours and the half-life of that is 10 hours, and not really giving any feel for the degree of variation. So that's one thing. The other thing is to try and tackle some of the misconceptions around race. And this is a massive area I haven't got time to touch on today, but I just wanted to highlight and draw to your attention a couple of resources for this. So this article by Alan Goodman, who's an anthropologist, it's a short read, but a very powerful read, talks about the degree of genetic diversity in different populations and the extent to which they overlap. And it also talks about the impact that this has had, or the genetics, these ideas of these misconceptions of genetics, the impact that they've had on a whole range of aspects of medicine. And this book by Alan Gissaini I found very helpful to just try and put everything into more of a sort of politics, sociological sort of perspective as well. And there's a chapter in here called The Black Pill about medicines. So I think, yeah, so they go into a lot of the background, but just sort of to take that background, I think the misconceptions are really almost intractable. I sort of worry that people have this misconception that there is a genetic basis to race. And what we need to do is to counter that misconception. So one is to agree on what the expert's view is. And so the expert view here is, multiple genes and multiple environmental factors interact in the development of most traits. So in pharmacokinetics, we're looking at a complex mixture of factors. The issue is really that in a lot of our biology teaching, particularly in schools, is the biology textbooks oversimplify genetics and they focus on monogenic traits. So a lot of students are coming out of their school education thinking that there is a genetic basis to race, and there isn't. And tackling misconceptions like this is really difficult. I remember doing a session with a year 10 group where there'd been some issues of racism, and I talked about this lack of link between genetics and race. And you could see the jaws hitting the floor. They were just gobsmacked by it, and really sort of surprised by it. And it was uncomfortable for them to address these misconceptions. There's also quite a nice literature on what we can do about education in order to break down this idea. So this is an example of a recent paper from Brian Donovan's group, where they look at genomics literacy and the impact that that has. So what they've shown, a number of groups have shown, is that the way we teach genetics can actually enhance racism. It can increase this prevalence of genetic essentialism or genetic determinism. But the good news is that it's possible to introduce interventions and teach differently so that we can tackle the misconception and reduce this prevalence of genetic essentialism. So I just wanted to highlight that, and that's something that I want to have a look into a little bit more detail as we start to develop these resources so we don't fall into some of the same traps. Two ways of avoiding misconceptions are potentially sort of avoiding this reliance on these broad categories, so the white versus Asian, and perpetuating that. And the other one is that it sort of comes back to a bit about what Shola was saying, and not using race or ethnicity as proxies for variables that could be measured directly. So if it is diet, that, look at the effect of diet. Don't sort of confound that. Don't have that as a confounding variable, if you like. Okay, so that sort of brings us to the end of our time. So if there are any questions, very happy to follow those up.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jenny and Shola, for a really interesting and mind-opening and eye-opening talk. That's some really, really fascinating stuff there. Thank you very much for that. And we look forward to hearing a bit more as the project evolves and develops.